They were convinced the night belonged to them. Japanese infantry advancing through the jungle darkness of Guadalcanal had broken American positions before, had overwhelmed defenders through sheer audacity and numbers, had proven that courage and cold steel could defeat firepower if delivered with enough violence and speed. On the night of October 24, 1942, approximately 2,000 Japanese soldiers moved through the rainforest toward a defensive position held by roughly 500 United States Marines. The Japanese commanders believed they were about to destroy an isolated American unit. They believed their numerical superiority of 4-1 would be decisive. They believed the darkness would protect them from American firepower. They were wrong about all of it. The story of what happened that night begins not with the battle itself, but with two entirely different philosophies of warfare colliding in the worst possible place for one of them. It begins with Japanese confidence built on real victories, and with Marine Corps preparation built on bitter lessons learned at terrible cost. It begins with men on both sides who believed they understood what was about to happen, and with only one side being correct. The question this story answers is not simply how 500 men survived an attack by 2,000. The question is why the attackers, despite overwhelming numbers and total tactical surprise regarding the location of the assault, suffered casualties so catastrophic that their offensive capability was destroyed in a single night. The answer reveals something profound about the nature of industrial warfare, about the difference between courage and capability, and about what happens when 19th century assault tactics meet 20th century defensive firepower. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Burwell Puller commanded the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. His men called him Chesty, a nickname earned through years of service that had taken him from Haiti to Nicaragua to China. Puller had joined the Marine Corps in 1918, too late to see action in World War I, and had spent the interwar years leading small unit actions against insurgents in Central America and the Caribbean. He understood infantry combat at the most fundamental level. He understood fields of fire, defensive preparation, and the mathematics of machine guns versus charging infantry. On October 23rd, Puller's battalion occupied a section of the defensive perimeter around Henderson Field, the crucial airstrip that both sides knew would determine control of Guadalcanal. The position was not chosen for its strength. It was chosen because it had to be held. The perimeter curved through jungle and kunai grass south of the airfield. Puller's sector covered approximately 2,500 yards of front, far too much for a single battalion that had already been reduced by disease, combat, and inadequate rations. The Marines had been on Guadalcanal since August 7th. It was now late October. They had fought the Battle of the Tenaru River, where Japanese attackers had been slaughtered, attempting to cross an open sandbar. They had fought at Edson's Ridge, where Marine raiders and paratroopers had barely held a critical height against repeated night assaults. They had learned what Japanese night attacks looked like, how they sounded, how they felt. They had learned that Japanese infantry would charge machine gun positions with bayonets fixed, screaming, accepting horrific casualties to close with defenders. They had learned that stopping these attacks required specific preparations, absolute fire discipline, and nerves that held steady when hundreds of men emerged from the darkness, determined to kill you with edged weapons. Guadalcanal was not supposed to be a major campaign. The invasion had been conceived as a limited operation to seize an airfield. The Japanese were building on an island most Americans had never heard of. The island itself was approximately 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, covered in dense jungle, steep ridges, and malarial swamps. The Japanese had landed in July 1942 and begun constructing an airfield at Lunga Point on the northern coast. American strategic planners recognized that an operational Japanese airfield on Guadalcanal would threaten the sea lanes between the United States and Australia. If Japan could interdict those supply routes, Australia might be isolated and the entire Southwest Pacific lost. The 1st Marine Division landed on August 7, 1942, seizing the incomplete airfield in a virtually unopposed landing. The Japanese garrison had fled into the jungle. Marines renamed the airfield Henderson Field after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator, killed at the Battle of Midway 2 months earlier. What followed was not the quick victory American planners had anticipated, but a grinding campaign of attrition that would last 6 months. The strategic situation was deceptively simple. Whoever controlled Henderson Field controlled the airspace around Guadalcanal during daylight hours. American aircraft operating from Henderson could attack Japanese ships, attempting to resupply or reinforce their troops on the island. But at night, the situation reversed. Japanese naval forces could move down the slot, the channel between the Solomon Islands, and bombard American positions or land reinforcements under cover of darkness. This pattern created a brutal rhythm. During the day, Americans controlled the air and could resupply by sea and air. During the night, Japanese warships owned the waters around Guadalcanal. The Japanese response to losing the airfield was immediate and confident. They would retake it. The initial counterattacks came, but in August, small-scale assaults that were bloodily repulsed. The Japanese commanders learned from these failures and began landing larger forces, building up strength for a decisive offensive. By October, approximately 20,000 Japanese troops were on Guadalcanal, compared to roughly 23,000 Marines and Army troops defending the perimeter around Henderson Field. Japanese military doctrine emphasized offensive spirit above all else. The Imperial Army's infantry regulations, written in the 1920s and 30s, stressed that attack was the supreme form of warfare. Defense was considered a temporary expedient, acceptable only as preparation for resuming the offensive. This doctrine had worked brilliantly in China, where Japanese forces repeatedly defeated larger Chinese armies through aggressive attacks. It had worked in Malaya and the Philippines, where rapid advances overwhelmed Allied defenders. Japanese infantry believed absolutely in the power of the bayonet charge, in the spiritual superiority of Japanese soldiers, and in the inevitability of victory if attacks were pressed with sufficient determination. Night attacks were a particular specialty. Japanese infantry trained extensively for night operations, learning to move silently through difficult terrain, to navigate by compass and terrain features in complete darkness, to coordinate attacks without radio communication. The logic was sound. Night attacks negated American advantages in artillery support and air power. Darkness made it difficult for defenders to identify targets and coordinate fire. If Japanese infantry could close with American positions before being detected, they could use bayonets and grenades to overwhelm defenders in close combat where American firepower advantages disappeared. This confidence was not blind faith. It was based on real achievements and rational assessment of Japanese capabilities. At the Battle of the Tenaru River on August 21st, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki had led approximately 900 Japanese soldiers in a night assault against Marine positions. The attack had been a disaster with over 800 Japanese killed, but the willingness of Japanese soldiers to continue attacking despite horrific casualties had impressed and disturbed the Marines who fought them. At Edson's Ridge on September 13th and 14th, Japanese forces had nearly broken through Marine defences in a series of night attacks that came terrifyingly close to overrunning the position. Only desperate fighting and the personal leadership of Colonel Merritt Edson had held the line. Japanese commanders drew lessons from these battles, but not the lessons American commanders drew. Where Americans saw that massed firepower could destroy attacking infantry regardless of their courage, Japanese commanders saw that attacks had failed due to insufficient force and inadequate preparation, not due to fundamental flaws in the tactic itself. Solution, from the Japanese perspective, was to attack with larger numbers, better coordination, and more thorough preliminary reconnaissance. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake commanded the Japanese 17th Army, responsible for operations on Guadalcanal. His chief of staff was Major General Yumio Nasu. Together, they planned an offensive to recapture Henderson Field in late October. The plan called for a multi-pronged attack. The main effort would come from the south, where the Sendai Division's infantry would assault the American perimeter. Supporting attacks would come from the east and west to prevent American commanders from concentrating forces against the main thrust. The Sendai Division was an elite unit with a proud history. Its soldiers were veterans who had fought in China and had absolute confidence in their training and leadership. They were told they would be attacking Americans who were exhausted, poorly supplied, and demoralized. Intelligence reports suggested the Marines were weak from malaria, short on ammunition, and suffering from inadequate rations. Japanese soldiers were informed that one more determined push would break American resistance and allow recapture of the airfield. The reality was more complicated. The Marines were indeed exhausted, malarial, and hungry. Rations had been reduced to 2 meals per day. Medical supplies were critically short. Malaria was endemic, with hundreds of men running fevers even as they manned defensive positions. But they were not demoralized, and they were not weak in the ways that mattered for the coming battle. They had ammunition, they had machine guns, they had artillery, and they had Chesty, a commander who understood exactly how to use all of those things to maximum effect against attacking infantry. Pulla's defensive sector ran along a ridge that offered some natural advantage but was far from ideal. The terrain sloped down from the ridge into dense jungle where visibility ended at 20 yards. The kunai grass, a tall, sharp-bladed vegetation that covered much of Guadalcanal, grew thick in places and provided concealment for anyone approaching the Marine positions. Rivers and streams cut through the area, creating natural avenues of approach that attacking forces could use to move closer before being detected. The 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, occupied positions that had been prepared over weeks of work. Marines had cleared fields of fire, cutting down vegetation to create killing zones in front of their positions. They had dug foxholes and connected them with shallow communication trenches. They had positioned machine guns with interlocking fields of fire, so that every approach was covered by at least 2 guns. They had registered artillery targets, marking specific points where pre-planned artillery fire could be called down if Japanese forces appeared. The battalion's organic weapons included Browning M1917, A, 1 water-cooled 30 caliber machine guns, the heavy, sustained fire weapons that formed the backbone of Marine defensive firepower. Each gun weighed 41 pounds without water or ammunition. With water jacket filled and a full ammunition belt loaded, the complete system weighed over 90 pounds. The guns fired from a tripod mount that provided stability and allowed accurate fire at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. The cyclic rate of fire was 400 to 600 rounds per minute, though sustained fire rates were kept lower to prevent barrel overheating. The ammunition was the M1906 30 caliber cartridge, later designated 30-06 Springfield. The full metal jacket ball round weighed 150 grains and left the barrel at 2,800 feet per second. At 500 yards, the round retained enough energy to penetrate steel helmets and light cover. The ammunition came in cloth belts, holding 250 rounds. A trained crew could change belts in seconds, maintaining nearly continuous fire. Each machine gun section included a gunner, assistant gunner, and ammunition bearers. The Marines had learned in previous battles that ammunition consumption during night attacks was enormous. Machine guns fired thousands of rounds during a single engagement. Pulla had ordered additional ammunition brought forward, stockpiling extra belts near each gun position. His calculation was simple. If Japanese forces attacked in strength, the battle would be decided by whether his machine guns could maintain fire long enough to break the attack. The battalion also had M1 Garand rifles, the semi-automatic weapon that gave American infantry a significant advantage in sustained fire over bolt-action rifles used by most other armies. Each Garand held 8 rounds in an internal magazine and could fire as fast as a trained rifleman could pull the trigger. The Marines in Pulla's battalion were trained riflemen. They had qualified on known distance ranges, learned to estimate range in field conditions, and practiced rapid fire until it became automatic, Mortars provided additional firepower. The 81mm mortar was a particularly effective weapon in jungle warfare. The weapon consisted of a tube, base plate, and bipod mount, weighing a total of 136 pounds when broken down for transport. The high-explosive round weighed just under 7 pounds and could be fired to ranges exceeding 3,000 yards. More importantly, the mortar's high angle of fire meant rounds dropped nearly vertically onto targets, making them effective against troops in foxholes or defilade positions where flat trajectory weapons could not reach. Artillery support came from the 11th Marines, the division's artillery regiment. They had 105mm howitzers positioned within range of Puller's sector. These guns fired a 33-pound high-explosive shell to ranges of 7 miles. The shells were devastating against infantry in the open, each round creating a casualty radius of approximately 35 yards. The artillery forward observers with Puller's battalion had already registered defensive fires, plotting coordinates for likely avenues of approach and assembly areas. The Japanese forces moving toward Puller's position on the night of October 24th were from the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 29th Infantry Regiment, Sendai Division. These were experienced soldiers who had trained together for years. They had fought in China, where their aggressive tactics had consistently defeated Chinese forces. They carried the Type 38 Arisaka rifle, a reliable bolt-action weapon firing the 6.5mm cartridge. The rifle was accurate and well-made, but it required the soldier to work the bolt between each shot, a significant disadvantage in rapid close-range fighting. Japanese infantry doctrine emphasized the bayonet. Every rifle was fitted with a bayonet, and soldiers trained extensively in bayonet fighting. The Type 30 bayonet had a 15.7-inch blade and was designed for thrusting attacks. Japanese infantry regulations stated that the bayonet was the supreme weapon of the infantry soldier, the final arbiter of combat. Soldiers were taught that spirit and determination could overcome firepower if they could close with the enemy. The Japanese plan called for a night approach march through the jungle, moving silently to assembly areas near the American perimeter. Once in position, the battalions would launch coordinated attacks at approximately 11 o'clock in the evening. The attacks would be preceded by mortar and artillery fire to suppress American positions. Then infantry would advance in waves, each wave pushing forward regardless of casualties, with following waves moving through or around any units that became pinned down. The approach march began in the late afternoon. Japanese soldiers moved in single file along jungle trails, each man following the man in front. They carried minimal equipment to reduce noise. Rifles were slung on shoulders. Bayonets were fixed. Each man carried rice balls for rations, a canteen of water, and as much ammunition as he could carry. The emphasis was on mobility and shock action rather than sustained combat capability. Japanese officers had briefed their men that American Marines were weak and demoralized. They were told that Marines had been without proper supply for weeks, that disease had reduced their effectiveness, that one determined attack would break their resistance. The soldiers believed this. They had seen American forces retreat in the Philippines. They had witnessed the surrender of Singapore. They had every reason to believe that Americans would collapse under a properly executed night assault. What the Japanese did not know was that Puller had been expecting exactly this kind of attack. Marine intelligence had detected increased Japanese activity south of the perimeter. Patrols had reported large numbers of Japanese soldiers moving through the jungle. Native scouts, working with the Marines, had provided information about Japanese assembly areas and approach routes. Puller knew an attack was coming. He did not know exactly when or where, but he had prepared for every likely possibility. On the afternoon of October 24th, Puller walked his entire defensive line, checking each position personally. He spoke with machine gun crews, verifying they had adequate ammunition and clear fields of fire. He checked with mortar crews, confirming they had plotted coordinates for defensive fires. He coordinated with his artillery forward observer, ensuring communications were working and that defensive fires were ready. He reminded his company commanders that fire discipline was critical, that Marines should hold fire until targets were clearly identified, that ammunition should not be wasted on noise or shadows. As darkness fell, the Marines waited. They had learned from previous battles that Japanese attacks often came around midnight, timed to achieve maximum shock and confusion. The night was dark, with thick cloud cover blocking moonlight and starlight. Visibility was measured in feet, not yards. Marines in foxholes could barely see the man in the next position. The jungle sounds were constant, the background noise of insects and nocturnal animals that made it difficult to detect human movement. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. At approximately 10:45 in the evening, Marines on the southern edge of Pulla's sector heard movement in the jungle ahead of their positions. Not the random noise of animals, but the purposeful sound of many men moving together. Whispered reports passed along the line. Something was coming. Company commanders alerted their platoons. Machine gun crews tensed behind their weapons. Riflemen checked, and their garans one final time, ensuring rounds were chambered and safeties were off. The Japanese artillery barrage began at 11 o'clock. Shells impacted across the Marine positions, 75mm mountain gun rounds that burst with sharp cracks and sent shrapnel whining through the darkness. The barrage was brief, lasting perhaps 10 minutes. It was intended to suppress the Marines, to keep them in their foxholes while Japanese infantry moved closer. It had limited effect. Marine positions were well dug in, and most of the shells burst in the jungle or in open areas between positions. When the barrage lifted, the Japanese infantry came forward. They moved in formation, maintaining unit cohesion even in the darkness. Officers led from the front. Soldiers followed, keeping contact with the men to their left and right. They had been trained for this. They had practiced night movement until it became instinctive. They believed they were approaching an American position that had been weakened by the artillery barrage, that the Marines would be disorganized and vulnerable. The reality was that every Marine in Pulla's sector was alert, in position, and ready. Machine gun crews had their weapons loaded and aimed into the darkness. Riflemen had selected their firing positions and cleared their fields of fire. Mortar crews had rounds ready and firing data prepared. The artillery forward observer was in communication with the gun batteries, ready to call fire on pre-registered targets. The first contact came when Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle approximately 75 yards from the Marine lines. A Marine rifleman saw movement, a darker shadow against the dark jungle. He fired a single shot. The Garan's report was sharp and loud in the night. The muzzle flash illuminated his position for an instant. The shot missed, but it served as a signal. Other Marines saw the movement now. More shots cracked out. Japanese soldiers dropped to prone positions and began returning fire with their Arisaka rifles. Then the Japanese infantry officers gave the order to charge. This was the tactic that had worked in China, that had broken Chinese defensive lines, that represented the core of Japanese infantry doctrine. Fix bayonets and advance, accepting casualties as necessary, closing with the enemy to use the bayonet in close combat. Japanese soldiers rose from prone positions and began moving forward at a run, screaming as they came, hundreds of men charging through the darkness toward the Marine positions. Pulla's machine guns opened fire. The sound was distinctive, the sustained hammering roar of water-cooled 30-caliber machine guns firing at cyclic rate. Tracer rounds arced through the darkness in flat orange lines, every fifth round a tracer that allowed gunners to observe their fire and adjust aim. The tracers showed the machine gun fire converging on the charging Japanese infantry from multiple positions, interlocking fields of fire that created zones where no one could survive. The effect on the Japanese formation was catastrophic. Men fell in groups as machine gun fire swept through their ranks. The soldiers behind them kept coming, stepping over bodies, maintaining momentum. More machine guns joined the firing. The noise became a continuous roar that drowned out everything else. Japanese soldiers trying to shout orders could not be heard over the machine gun fire. The Japanese infantry continued to advance despite the casualties. This was what they had been trained to do. Japanese doctrine did not allow for withdrawal once an attack had begun. Officers led their men forward, waving swords, shouting encouragement that could not be heard over the gunfire. Soldiers who fell wounded were passed by following waves that maintained the attack momentum. The charge carried them closer to the Marine positions, within 50 yards, then 40, then 30. At this range, every Marine rifleman could engage, effectively. The Garand rifles added their fire to the machine guns. Semi-automatic fire poured into the attacking Japanese soldiers. A trained Marine rifleman could fire aimed shots as fast as he could acquire targets and pull the trigger. The Garand's 8-round capacity meant fewer reloads compared to bolt-action rifles. Marines fired, emptied their rifles, reloaded, and fired again in continuous cycles. The 81mm mortars began firing illumination rounds. These were special shells that burst at altitude and deployed parachute-suspended flares that drifted slowly downward, casting harsh white light across the battlefield. The illumination revealed the full scope of the Japanese attack. Hundreds of soldiers were advancing in waves, climbing over their own dead, still coming forward despite losses that would have broken most units. The illumination also allowed the Marine machine gunners and riflemen to see their targets clearly. Firing shifted from area fire into darkness to precise aimed fire at visible targets. The casualty rate among the attacking Japanese infantry increased. Men fell in groups. Entire squads were cut down in seconds. The attack began to lose cohesion as units became disorganized by casualties and terrain. The artillery forward observer with Puller's battalion called for fire on pre-registered defensive targets. Within 2 minutes, 105mm shells were impacting in the areas where Japanese forces were assembling for follow-on waves. The high explosive shells burst with tremendous concussive force, each one creating casualties across a wide area. Japanese soldiers waiting to advance found themselves under artillery bombardment that they could not counter or avoid. Some Japanese soldiers reached the Marine positions. These men had survived the machine gun fire, the rifle fire, the mortars, and the artillery. They jumped into Marine foxholes with bayonets fixed, engaging in the close-quarters combat that Japanese doctrine emphasized. These individual fights were brief and brutal. Marines used their garands as clubs when there was no time to fire. Some drew their Kabar fighting knives, 7-inch bladed weapons that were standard Marine issue. The fighting was hand-to-hand, desperate and decisive. But these penetrations were isolated. Most of the Japanese force never reached the Marine lines. The defensive firepower was simply too intense. Machine guns fired until barrels glowed red in the darkness. Ammunition bearers hauled forward more belts, keeping the guns supplied. When one gun overheated and had to cease firing temporarily, adjacent guns increased their rate of fire to cover the gap. The system Puller had designed worked exactly as intended. The first Japanese attack lasted approximately 45 minutes from the initial charge to the moment when the surviving soldiers pulled back into the jungle. In that time, Japanese forces suffered casualties estimated at 60–70% in the units that made the assault. The Marines counted bodies in the illumination light. Japanese dead lay in rows where machine gun fire had caught them. Some areas had bodies stacked 2 and 3 deep, where following waves had advanced over the men who fell first. Japanese commanders regrouped their forces and prepared for a second attack. This decision reflected the inflexibility of Japanese tactical doctrine. The plan called for capturing the Marine positions through infantry assault. The first attack had failed, but failure was attributed to insufficient determination or inadequate execution, not to fundamental problems with the approach. The solution was to attack again with greater intensity. The second attack came shortly after midnight. Japanese forces had taken time to reorganize, to gather survivors from the first assault, to prepare fresh troops for another attempt. Artillery fire preceded the attack again, brief and intense, impacting across the marine positions. When the barrage lifted, Japanese infantry advanced once more, moving through terrain now littered with their own dead from the first attack. The marine response was identical to the first engagement. Machine guns opened fire at maximum effective range, riflemen engaged visible targets, mortars fired high explosive and illumination rounds. Artillery struck assembly areas and approach routes. The Japanese infantry suffered the same catastrophic casualties, but they continued to advance with the same determination. Some units made it closer to the marine lines this time, having learned to use terrain and dead ground to reduce exposure to fire. But the outcome was the same. Attacking infantry were cut down by defensive fire that they could not suppress or avoid. A third attack came before dawn. Japanese commanders committed their remaining reserves, throwing every available soldier into the assault. The logic was desperate, but understandable. They had been ordered to break through the marine lines. They had suffered enormous casualties attempting to do so. Withdrawing without achieving the objective would mean admitting failure. Better to continue attacking, to expend every last soldier if necessary, than to retreat without success. This final attack achieved nothing except to increase the Japanese casualty count. Marine defenders were exhausted but still functional. Ammunition supplies remained adequate despite the enormous expenditure. The defensive positions remained intact. When dawn broke on October 25th, the battlefield in front of Puller's sector was covered with Japanese dead. Marines estimated between 600 and 900 bodies could be counted in the immediate area. Total Japanese casualties for all attacks against Puller's sector during the night were later estimated at approximately 1,500 to 1,800 killed. The Marines had suffered casualties as well, but nothing remotely comparable. Puller's battalion reported approximately 25 killed and 35 wounded during the night's fighting. The disparity was stunning. Against a force 4 times their size, attacking repeatedly with absolute determination, the Marines had inflicted 60 to 70 casualties for every Marine lost. Japanese survivors retreated into the jungle as daylight made further attacks impossible. The soldiers who withdrew were physically and psychologically shattered. They had been told they would break through American defenses. They had been assured that one determined attack would scatter the Marines. Instead, they had been slaughtered by firepower they could not overcome. Officers who had led men forward with confidence were dead. Soldiers who had trusted in their training and their doctrine had watched their units destroyed. The captured Japanese soldiers, the wounded who could not withdraw, and the isolated individuals cut off by the Marine counterattack at dawn told interrogators similar stories. They expressed shock at American firepower. They described machine gun fire that seemed continuous, that never slackened regardless of how many men fell. They talked about the artillery that struck their assembly areas and the mortars that fell among them as they prepared to attack. They mentioned the illumination rounds that exposed them in the darkness, making them targets for rifles and machine guns. Most significantly, they expressed a fundamental questioning of everything they had been taught. The doctrine that emphasized spirit over material, that insisted attacks pressed with sufficient determination would always succeed, that claimed Japanese soldiers were inherently superior to American soldiers, all of it had been proven catastrophically wrong. They had attacked with maximum determination. They had accepted casualties that would have broken any other army. They had followed their officers into fire that killed most of them, and they had achieved nothing. The broader Japanese offensive against the Henderson Field perimeter failed completely. Other units attacking different sectors suffered similar casualties. The Sendai Division, which had entered the battle as an elite formation with high morale and confidence, was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Casualty estimates for the entire October offensive ranged from 2,500 to 3,500 Japanese soldiers killed. American casualties for the same period were approximately 200 killed. The disparity reflected more than just the advantage of defensive positions. It reflected the industrial reality of World War II. The United States could equip every infantryman with a semi-automatic rifle when most armies still used bolt-action weapons. American forces had machine guns in abundance, not carefully rationed among units. Artillery ammunition was available in quantities that allowed pre-registered defensive fires and sustained bombardment. Illumination rounds, a specialized munition that many armies could not afford to use freely, were employed routinely by American forces. Japanese forces attempting to fight this kind of war with 1930s equipment and doctrine were not just outmatched, they were attempting something fundamentally impossible. Courage could not overcome the firepower disparity. Training could not compensate for inferior weapons. Determination could not defeat an enemy who had more guns, more ammunition, and better equipment at every level. The psychological impact extended beyond the individual soldiers who survived. Japanese commanders recognized that their tactical doctrine had failed against American defensive firepower, but changing doctrine required admitting that the principles they had taught for decades were wrong. It required acknowledging that attacks pressed with sufficient spirit would not always succeed. It required accepting that American forces were not weak or cowardly, but were competent, soldiers equipped with superior weapons. These admissions came slowly, if at all. Japanese forces continued to launch night attacks throughout the Pacific War. They continued to emphasize bayonet charges and close combat. They continued to accept enormous casualties, attempting to achieve tactical objectives that were not achievable through infantry assault. The pattern established at Guadalcanal repeated on Tarawa, on Saipan, on Peleliu, on Iwo Jima, on Okinawa. Japanese infantry attacked. American firepower destroyed them. The casualty ratios remained lopsided. For the Marines who fought at Guadalcanal, the lessons were different but equally profound. They learned that defensive preparation mattered enormously. Clear fields of fire, interlocking machine gun positions, registered artillery fires, adequate ammunition supplies, all of these technical details made the difference between victory and defeat. They learned that their weapons were effective if used properly. The Garand rifle, the Browning machine gun, the 81mm mortar, the 105mm howitzer, all performed as designed. Most importantly, they learned that numerical superiority meant nothing if the smaller force had better weapons and used them effectively. 500 Marines had defeated 2,000 Japanese soldiers, not through superior courage or fighting spirit, but through superior firepower and preparation. The lesson was unglamorous but essential. In modern industrial warfare, logistics and equipment often mattered more than individual heroism. Chesty received the Navy Cross for his leadership during the defense. It was his third Navy Cross. He would earn 2 more before the war ended, making him the most decorated Marine in the Corps' history. But the real story was not about Puller's personal heroism. It was about a system that worked. The Marine Corps had developed doctrine, trained its men, equipped them properly, and placed them in positions where they could use their advantages effectively. The Japanese soldiers who died in front of Puller's positions were not cowards. They were not poorly trained. They attacked with as much courage and determination as any soldiers in any war, but they were sent to accomplish something their equipment and doctrine could not achieve. They were ordered to defeat an enemy who had more firepower, better defensive positions, and a clear understanding of how to use both. The outcome was predetermined by these material factors, regardless of how bravely the Japanese soldiers fought. When Marines walked through the battlefield at dawn on October 25th, examining the carnage, they understood something fundamental about the war they were fighting. This was not a contest of spirits or wills. It was a contest of industrial capacity and military effectiveness. The nation that could produce more weapons, train more soldiers, supply them adequately, and employ them according to sound doctrine would win. Everything else was secondary. The Japanese commanders who ordered the attacks at Guadalcanal believed they were employing tactics that had worked in China and would work again. They believed American forces would break under determined assault. They believed that spirit and courage were decisive factors in combat. The bodies stacked in front of the Marine positions proved them wrong. In the harsh mathematics of machine guns versus charging infantry, the machine guns won. They won decisively, overwhelmingly, and repeatedly. That night in October 1942, 500 Marines proved that in modern warfare, preparation and firepower defeat courage and numbers. The lesson cost approximately 1,800 Japanese soldiers their lives. It saved the Marine positions and helped secure Henderson Field, ensuring American control of Guadalcanal and contributing to eventual victory in the Pacific. But the human cost of learning that lesson, of discovering that everything that they had been taught was wrong, fell hardest on the Japanese soldiers who attacked believing they would succeed and died understanding they never had a chance. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.